The air inside the chamber was thick enough to taste, metallic, electric, the kind of silence that knows a storm is coming. Cameras clicked in restless rhythm, a digital heartbeat echoing through marble and microphones. Every seat was filled, every gaze fixed on the table where two worlds were about to collide. Patel sat with the posture of a man certain he was untouchable. His grin was practiced, the kind that said he'd played this game before and expected to win it again. Across from him, Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett adjusted her microphone with slow precision, her expression unreadable, her composure almost unnerving. Reporters leaned forward, staffers stopped typing. Even the hum of the air conditioner seemed to fade. For a split second, all that existed was the space between her calm and his swagger. Patel's hand rested casually on the desk, fingertips drumming against polished wood. His confidence was armor. Her silence was a loaded weapon. Then she spoke. No preamble, no build-up, just the quiet authority of someone who didn't need to shout to be heard. Her voice slid through the air, measured, deliberate. "Mr. Patel," she said, "if everything you've claimed is true, then why does your own record contradict you?" It wasn't the question itself that froze the room. It was the way she asked it, each word like a note struck on a glass bell. Patel blinked, his smirk flickered. For a man who thrived on quick comebacks, this one landed like a blow he hadn't seen coming. The silence that followed felt endless. Seconds stretched, heavy and trembling. Somewhere in the gallery, a camera shutter snapped, capturing the exact moment arrogance met consequence. Patel's lips parted, but no words came. His smirk tried to return and failed. Crockett didn't move. She just watched him, eyes steady, calm as a judge waiting for the truth to remember its lines. The narrator's voice cut through, low and grave, as if speaking to the viewer's conscience itself. What you're about to see isn't theater. It's a test of the nation's moral spine. Because sometimes the loudest truth begins with silence. And in that silence, a man built on bluster met the truth he could no longer dodge. But to understand how we got to that silence, we have to rewind.
Rewind the tape. The room hadn't yet fallen silent. It was still pulsing with the kind of noise that only power can generate. Lawmakers talked over one another, microphones clipped, and phrases like, "I reclaim my time," sliced through the air like thrown blades. On one side sat the loyalists, tight smiles, rehearsed outrage, nodding on cue. On the other, the weary faces of those who had watched too many hearings dissolve into theater. Somewhere between them sat Patel, his confidence radiating like heat off pavement, a man who believed he could outtalk accountability itself. The narrator's tone deepens, drawing the audience in as if the story isn't unfolding in Washington, but in the viewer's own living room. You've seen this before, haven't you? The smirk, the swagger, the certainty that truth can be bent with enough volume. Tell me, where are you watching from? Because this moment isn't DC versus America. It's all of us deciding what we tolerate. On the screen, Patel speaks in long, looping sentences that go nowhere. Each word is a deflection, each pause a calculation. He smirks when challenged, leans back when cornered, and when facts are placed in front of him, he pivots like a dancer avoiding the light. Around him, the cameras love it, the spectacle, the bravado, the illusion of control. It's performance, not policy. And the audience, both in the room and across the country, feels that ache of recognition, the exhaustion of watching arrogance pose as intellect. The narrator continues, soft yet piercing. Integrity versus impunity, that's the choice being made in real time. Every smirk, every dodge, every empty phrase is another test of whether truth still has weight in the age of noise. This isn't just a hearing, it's a reflection, a mirror held up to a culture addicted to spin. Cut to the panel, where faces reveal everything that decorum hides. Some lawmakers look away, unwilling to engage. Others lean forward, ready for a fight they know won't come easy. Patel's eyes flicker with the confidence of a man who's been rewarded for never admitting he's wrong. He mistakes volume for victory, mistaking attention for respect. The narrator's voice edges toward frustration, echoing what millions feel. How many times have we watched this play out? How many times has accountability drowned beneath rehearsed outrage and partisan noise? Truth is under siege, not because it's weak, because it's quiet. And in a world addicted to the loudest voice, quiet can feel invisible. The camera pans across the audience seated behind the panel, faces of citizens, journalists, staffers. Some nod, some shake their heads, some simply watch with folded arms, tired of being disappointed. And yet, amid that fatigue, something is about to shift. Enter Jasmine Crockett. She isn't loud when she walks in. She doesn't need to be. There's a gravity to her silence, a steadiness that draws focus without demanding it. She doesn't perform. She prepares. The contrast is immediate. Where Patel thrives on chaos, she commands stillness. Her notepad is already filled. Her questions aren't designed to grandstand. They're built to pierce. The narrator leans in once more, almost whispering now. Every era has its noise, but every era also has its voice, the one that cuts through, the one the noise can't drown. And that day, in that chamber, she was about to become that voice. The air tightens again, anticipation rising like a held breath. Conversations taper off, eyes turn toward her, and the noise that once dominated the room begins to fracture under the weight of her calm. But when she finally spoke, the temperature in that room changed. Because arrogance doesn't appear out of nowhere, it's cultivated.
Before the silence, before the question that cracked his armor, there was the rise. Kash Patel didn't stumble into the spotlight, he engineered it. A former aide turned media darling, he learned early that in politics, perception could be sculpted like marble. He knew which cameras to face, which phrases to repeat until they became headlines. His power wasn't policy, it was presence, the art of seeming untouchable. He spoke in certainties, never doubts. His interviews were performances, smirks in place of evidence, sarcasm standing in for truth. Every confrontation became an audition for the next one. When facts pressed too close, he changed the script, redirecting attention with a grin. To some, he was clever. To others, corrosive. But to himself, he was the smartest man in any room he entered. The narrator's voice drapes over his origin like a warning. In an age where sound bites outshout substance, Patel became fluent in noise. He mastered the rhythm of outrage, the economy of deflection. When cornered, he didn't retreat, he performed. He strutted through hearings like a man playing chess with pawns he didn't respect, assuming everyone else was too slow to notice the game. Montage, Patel sitting before cameras, leaning back with calculated ease. Patel laughing off tough questions with lines rehearsed for the evening news. Patel on talk shows, his name glowing in lower thirds, promising to set the record straight. The applause never came from truth, it came from theater. The headlines flash by in quick succession. Patel skewers critics in a fiery hearing, unapologetic and unbothered. Defiant aide pushes back on accountability. The coverage fed the myth he'd built, of a man too sharp to be cornered, too slick to be caught. Each clip fed his confidence, and with each one, his distance from humility widened. Inside the halls of power, colleagues described him with phrases that sounded like compliments, but weren't. He knows how to play the game. He's a survivor. He always has a line ready. But survival built on spectacle has an expiration date, and his was approaching faster than he realized. The narrator's tone lowers. Watch closely, because arrogance doesn't just appear, it's cultivated. It feeds on applause, on the comfort of being unchallenged. Patel surrounded himself with yes-men, echo chambers that mirrored his own confidence back at him. The more he performed, the more he believed the role he was. He wasn't just defending a position anymore. He was defending the image of himself he'd sold to the public. And in that belief lay the seed of collapse. He thought control came from dominance, from talking louder and faster, from turning every confrontation into a circus. But control that depends on chaos is a fragile kind. Every smirk, every dismissive wave of the hand, every condescending laugh was a thread pulling at the edges of his own illusion. There were moments, small, fleeting ones, when the mask almost slipped. During a late-night interview, when a journalist pressed harder than expected, his grin faltered for half a breath. When asked for specifics instead of slogans, his words stumbled. The camera cut away before most noticed, but the truth had peeked through. The man who thrived on control hated questions he couldn't control. Still, he powered forward. The next day, he doubled down. The next week, he turned the falter into a joke. "They just don't get it," he said, waving off the clip like a gnat. "The media's scared because I tell it straight." His followers cheered. The applause returned. The mask reset. But masks, even well-crafted ones, begin to crack under repetition. The narrator continues, slower now, almost surgical. He'd mistaken attention for authority, applause for absolution. Each time the truth cornered him, he talked louder, believing the sound itself could drown it out. But truth doesn't fade with volume. It waits. And it waited for him. Patel walked into that hearing convinced he'd play the same game again. Talk circles around the questions, make the committee look confused, leave with another clip to post. He didn't see the difference this time. He didn't see that the woman seated across from him wasn't playing for spectacle. She wasn't there to trade insults or angles. She was there for answers. And that difference would undo him. The camera freezes on his confident half-smile, the grin that had carried him through every confrontation. The narrator pauses, just long enough for the audience to feel the shift. But arrogance only works until someone refuses to play along. But where he relied on noise, she relied on something far rarer.
Jasmine Crockett didn't begin her career in the glow of national cameras. Her first courtroom was a cramped county space in Texas, where the air conditioner rattled louder than the judge's gavel. She came armed with case files stacked higher than her paycheck, wearing the same suit 3 days in a row, determined that the truth would still sound like truth even when whispered from the back bench. Those early days shaped her like pressure shapes glass. Heat, resistance, clarity. She learned that power doesn't have to shout to be felt. In those rooms, she faced the quiet arrogance of men who mistook condescension for authority. They underestimated her before she ever spoke, and then, once she did, they scrambled to recover. There were nights she went home furious, replaying every exchange, every slight disguised as civility. But anger became focus, and focus became fuel. She carried that edge with her, not bitterness, but precision, because she understood early what so many forget. The system listens differently depending on who's speaking. Flashback. A courtroom packed with murmuring spectators. A prosecutor cuts her off mid-sentence. She doesn't interrupt back. She waits, eyes locked, breath steady. When she finally continues, her words slice clean through the room. "I wasn't finished." That line became a calling card. Not shouted, but solid. Not performed, but earned. She didn't raise her voice. She raised the temperature. The narrator's voice settles into admiration laced with resolve. Crockett isn't a story of luck or timing. She's a story of endurance. When others courted visibility, she courted justice. While some built brands, she built a record. She defended those who couldn't afford silence, and in doing so, learned to weaponize calm. Every hearing, every debate, every sneer from across the aisle added another layer to her composure. Critics called it attitude. Supporters called it courage. To her, it was neither. It was simply survival in a system designed to doubt her. Truth, she learned, isn't volume. It's precision. It's not how loud you speak. It's how exact your words land. She carried that belief into every chamber she entered, knowing that sometimes the most devastating line is the one delivered without a tremor. The narrator pauses, then softens. For every woman told she was too bold, for every black voice dismissed as too loud, for every truth punished for its confidence, this was not just her fight, it was theirs. She stood for the ones who had learned to smile through dismissal, who had been told their power was impolite. Her presence in that hearing was not just political, it was generational. She didn't posture, she prepared. While Patel rehearsed deflections, she studied facts. While he counted cameras, she counted contradictions. She knew that battles like these aren't won in noise, they're won in patience. Her weapon wasn't outrage, it was readiness.
The morning of the hearing, she arrived early. No entourage, no grand entrance. She sat quietly, scanning the room, the weight of her role balanced between her shoulders like a mantle she'd long since grown used to carrying. The staffers whispered, the photographers checked their lenses. Across the aisle, Patel adjusted his tie, smirk intact. Crockett simply watched him, taking in his body language the way a surgeon studies an X-ray. Every movement told her something. Every glance revealed a weakness. The narrator speaks again, slower now, as if letting the audience feel her pulse. Calm is not the absence of fire, it's the mastery of it. Crockett carried that mastery into the hearing. Her tone was measured, her breathing even, her posture unshakable. She didn't fidget, didn't roll her eyes, didn't engage in spectacle, because she understood that when arrogance performs, composure wins by existing. Flash to a memory. A young Jasmine, standing outside a courthouse after losing a case she should have won. Her mentor's voice still echoes in her memory. You can't teach them to listen, but you can make silence your ally. That line stayed with her, engraved like scripture. Years later, sitting across from Patel, she would summon it again. The country knew her now as the Congresswoman who asked hard questions, the one who refused to dilute her tone to be palatable. But beneath the headlines was the same woman from those Texas courtrooms, the one who understood that truth, when wielded carefully, could cut through marble. She didn't need theatrics. She was the storm after the noise. The narrator draws the parallel clearly now. He relied on manipulation. She relied on method. He rehearsed lines. She prepared receipts. The difference wasn't style, it was substance. Patel's confidence came from control. Crockett's came from conviction. When he lied, he sold. When she spoke, she revealed. And yet, even knowing all this, she didn't walk into that hearing expecting an easy victory. She knew that speaking truth to arrogance often means being interrupted, dismissed, or twisted. She'd lived it before, but this time, she wasn't the one trying to be heard. She was the one holding the microphone. The camera pans to her expression in the moments before their exchange. Her gaze steady, her voice rehearsed not for delivery but for impact. She didn't intend to humiliate, she intended to clarify. But truth, when spoken clearly, often does both. The narrator leans in for the final beat. When Patel tried his usual playbook, deflect, dismiss, dominate, Crockett didn't flinch. She waited.
She waited because she'd spent a lifetime preparing for this moment, for this kind of man, for this brand of arrogance that always assumes the last word belongs to it. And when those two worlds collided, the air itself began to tighten. The exchange began like a match struck in slow motion. Patel leaned forward, his voice thick with practiced confidence, his words tumbling over one another like they were trying to outrun accountability. He smiled as he spoke, the kind of smile that dared anyone to challenge him. The committee room, already tense, began to shift its weight. Chairs creaked, pens stopped moving, the air tightened. Crockett sat still, her gaze fixed but unreadable. Every interruption, every deflection seemed to glance off her like pebbles against glass. Patel thought he was steering the moment. He wasn't. He was digging his own trench. He interrupted once, then twice, then 3 times, each time louder, each time more desperate to reassert dominance. His hands cut through the air, gesturing broadly, drowning meaning in motion. "What you don't understand," he started, only to talk over her again. The narrator's tone slows to a steady beat. You could feel it. The shift. The subtle reversal that arrogance never notices until it's too late. Her silence wasn't submission. It was calculation. Crockett waited. She didn't need to rush. She let him fill the room with noise, with all the false certainty that had carried him through every previous confrontation. The more he spoke, the smaller his control became. His words began to fray around the edges, his confidence cracking just slightly under the weight of its own performance. Eyes in the room started to shift. Reporters lowered their pens and raised their brows. Staffers exchanged glances. Even the chairman's gavel paused in midair, unsure whether to intervene or simply let this unravel on its own. There was something different about the energy now, something almost gravitational pulling toward her stillness. Patel, oblivious, kept going. He was performing for the cameras, gesturing toward them as if the audience beyond the lens would rescue him. "Let's be honest," he said. "You're not interested in facts." His tone tilted between charm and condescension, a smirk sharpening the insult. Crockett didn't bite. She didn't blink. The silence between his words stretched, and in that silence, his sentences began to echo hollow. Every time he laughed, it sounded forced. Every time he smiled, it looked strained. The crowd felt it before he did, the unraveling of a performance that had gone one act too long. The narrator's voice drops, deliberate. There's a kind of power that doesn't need to declare itself. It waits, steady as a fuse before ignition. And that's what she became, a quiet, waiting flame. He interrupted again, reaching for control he no longer had. "Let me finish," he snapped, though he had been talking uninterrupted for minutes. It was almost reflex, the way power insists on having the last word, even when it has nothing left to say. Crockett exhaled softly, leaned slightly forward, and glanced at her notes. The motion was small, but it was enough to signal a shift. Patel saw it too late. His voice faltered, his rhythm broke, and for a heartbeat the room seemed to hold its breath. A murmur rippled across the chamber, low and uncertain. Someone whispered, "She's got him." The cameras adjusted, lenses narrowing on her expression, still calm, still composed, but now alive with intent. The temperature had changed again. The quiet wasn't emptiness, it was anticipation. Patel tried to recover, reaching for the bravado that had carried him through the first half of the exchange. "If you just listen," he began, but it was too late. The sentence died in midair. The narrator's tone turns clinical. That's the danger of arrogance. It assumes silence is surrender, when in truth, it's a countdown. Crockett folded her hands, the faintest trace of a smile flickering at the corner of her mouth. Not triumph, but recognition. She'd seen this before, countless times. The louder they became, the closer they were to breaking. The rhythm shifted again, her control absolute. In that charged stillness, even the cameras seemed to lean in. Patel stopped mid-gesture, the weight of his own performance pressing against him. His face reddened slightly. His laugh, thin and nervous, failed to bridge the tension. She waited 1 beat, 2, 3. The narrator whispers now, the words nearly indistinguishable from the hum of the room. Silence has gravity, and it was pulling him down inch by inch. Then, in a voice that cut clean through the static, Crockett spoke. It wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. Her words landed with surgical precision. And then she asked the question that cracked the mask, until one question cut through every layer of noise. For a heartbeat, time forgot to move. Every breath in the room seemed to hang suspended between the echo of her question and the answer that refused to come. The question itself wasn't loud or dramatic. It didn't need to be. It was a razor disguised as reason, a truth so precisely worded it sliced through the fog of performance without drawing blood. "Mr. Patel," she'd asked, her tone steady, surgical, "if your integrity is as sound as you claim, then why does your sworn statement contradict the evidence you submitted?" It was the kind of question no amount of swagger could deflect, because it didn't challenge his politics, it challenged his honesty. The silence that followed was deafening. 6 seconds of silence, then another 3. Cameras clicked in staccato rhythm. 1, 2, 3. The sound was the only thing moving. Mechanical eyes capturing every twitch, every swallow, every microscopic flinch that betrayed the man who had spent years pretending he couldn't be cornered. Patel's smirk twitched. His fingers tapped against the table once, then twice. His eyes darted, not toward Crockett, but toward the gallery, toward the witnesses, the aides, the sea of faces watching the empire of his confidence begin to fracture. He opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. The first attempt came out as a half-chuckle, brittle and misplaced. "Congresswoman," he said, his voice too high, too rehearsed, "I think you're misunderstanding." Crockett didn't move. She didn't even blink. The silence that followed was its own kind of authority, pressing down on him until his words began to shrink. "Misunderstanding?" she repeated softly, not to him, but to the air, as if inviting the room to hear the absurdity in his deflection. The word lingered like smoke. Patel tried again. "Look, with all due respect." The narrator's voice slipped into the moment, low and measured, almost reverent. Respect, he said, was what he demanded. Accountability is what he received. A rustle rippled through the chamber. The chairman shifted in his seat. A few aides exchanged glances that said everything without words. They could feel it, the precise moment when power began to tilt. Patel's laughter came next, thin and performative. "I think we're losing sight of the bigger picture here," he said, trying to redirect, trying to breathe life back into the script he'd used 100 times before. But it was gone. The room wasn't buying it. The cameras weren't buying it. Even his own voice betrayed him, cracking faintly on the word bigger. The narrator again. 6 seconds of silence had done what 6 years of debate could not. In that silence, accountability finally had a voice. Crockett leaned back slightly, her hands folded, her eyes never leaving his. It wasn't victory, it was patience rewarded. She didn't shout, she didn't flinch. She didn't need to. Patel's words stumbled forward, trying to regain footing. "Congresswoman, if you'd allow me to clarify." "Clarify what?" she asked, still calm. "Your record or your recollection?" The question hit like a soft-spoken explosion. Gasps broke through the room, sharp and involuntary. Reporters' pens hit paper. Someone in the gallery whispered, "Oh my God." It wasn't a spectacle. It was a reckoning happening live. Patel tried to recover, but the ground had already vanished beneath him. "This is political theater," he said, forcing a smile that didn't reach his eyes, "and you're playing to the cameras." Crockett turned slightly toward the camera, just enough to let the irony breathe. "Then I hope they're watching closely," she said, her tone unshaken, "because the truth deserves an audience." For a moment, the entire hearing felt suspended in amber. Even time seemed unwilling to move past what had just been said. Patel blinked, realizing too late that every second of his hesitation was being immortalized. Every nervous swallow, every shallow breath, every failing attempt at control. The narrator spoke again, almost whispering now, like someone afraid to disturb the gravity of the scene. "Every empire of noise meets its quiet end, and when it does, the silence doesn't ask for permission." Crockett's gaze never wavered. The sound of her breath was steady, deliberate. Across from her, Patel's composure began to crumble in increments. A tightening jaw, a shifting shoulder, a tremor in the fingertips he tried to hide beneath the desk. He cleared his throat, voice thinner now. "I've answered that already," he insisted, though everyone in the room knew he hadn't. "You've spoken. You haven't answered." It landed like a verdict. The last of his defense fell apart under the weight of its own pretense. The camera zoomed closer, lenses drawing in like vultures circling the moment that would replay across every screen in America. He tried one last time, reaching for the old tools: sarcasm, dismissal, false confidence. "Well, I suppose that's your interpretation," he muttered. Crockett smiled faintly, not cruelly, just knowingly. "No, that's your record." The words echoed through the chamber. No one moved. Even the gavel seemed hesitant to interrupt. For a long, breathless instant, all that existed was the sound of Patel's exhale, the quiet sound of a man realizing the show was over.
She didn't shout, she didn't flinch, she didn't need to. Because truth, when it's finally spoken without apology, doesn't need volume to be heard. It just needs space. And in that room, she had carved out more than space. She had created silence, sharp enough to cut through years of noise. The narrator's tone shifts upward, swelling like the slow rise of a score before the credits. What makes a moment go viral isn't spectacle, it's recognition. Recognition of the thing we've been waiting to see: integrity standing its ground. Patel's face had changed entirely now. The smirk that once came so easily was gone, replaced with something that looked like realization, or maybe just exhaustion. He leaned back, looking smaller than before, as if the room had grown too large for him. Crockett glanced down at her papers once more, not to read, but to signal the end. She didn't need to say another word. Her silence said everything. The committee chair, finally breaking the trance, cleared his throat and muttered, "Let's move on." But the room didn't move. It couldn't. The narrator closes the scene, soft but resolute. What broke him wasn't the question, it was the mirror it forced him to face. Because when arrogance meets truth, one of them always runs out of air first. The cameras captured his final moment of denial,
The faint, desperate smile that flickered and then faded completely. The smirk that built a career finally ran out of air. What followed was not applause, but a nationwide eruption. By the time the hearing adjourned, the country was already watching on loop. The clip, 9 seconds of silence, 3 words of truth, had become digital wildfire. Within an hour, it climbed to the top of X's trending chart. Hashtag Crockett versus Patel. Hashtag Truth on the Record. Hashtag 9 seconds. Millions hit replay, mesmerized by the stillness, the way that silence seemed to hum louder than any outburst ever could. For millions, that silence spoke louder than 1,000 debates. It was the moment people didn't know they were waiting for, arrogance finally running out of breath, and composure proving it never needed to raise its voice to win. Reaction videos flooded timelines. A teacher in Detroit paused her lesson to play it for her civics class. A retired nurse in Atlanta wiped tears as she typed, "This is why we vote." TikTokers dissected every micro-expression. His twitch, her calm, the split second where power shifted. Memes turned his smirk into a cautionary symbol, captioned with lines like, "When the lie meets its expiration date." Cable news ran the clip endlessly. Anchors replayed it frame by frame, analyzing body language like forensic evidence. One commentator said, "This wasn't a debate, it was a recalibration of tone, a reminder that truth doesn't need to yell." Another added, "You could see it happen, the exact second when the illusion of control shattered." The sound design of the moment, the camera clicks, the faint murmur, the pregnant pause became cinematic lore. Editors slowed it down, overlaid it with swelling orchestral scores, turning political footage into a morality play. It wasn't just politics anymore, it was poetry with consequences. Politicians scrambled to respond. Some tried to spin it, claiming the Congresswoman was grandstanding. But the defense fell flat, drowned by the sheer authenticity of what everyone had witnessed. Allies of Crockett rallied publicly. Senator Booker tweeted, "That's what courage under fire looks like." Representative Ocasio-Cortez called it a masterclass in restraint and truth. Even late-night hosts joined in, replaying the clip before quipping, "9 seconds of silence, America's new favorite sound." Meanwhile, Patel's team went into crisis mode. Drafted statements were leaked, apologies that didn't sound like apologies, clarifications that clarified nothing. His supporters reposted old videos of his past bravado, trying to rebuild the myth. But each replay of that silence undid their effort. Every denial only amplified the one thing he couldn't outtalk, the truth that stared back at him. The narrator's voice returns, steady and reverent. That's the thing about moments like this. They don't just trend, they transform. In a nation so used to shouting, the quietest sound became the loudest reckoning. Communities lit up with discussion threads. Activists clipped the footage into motivational edits, pairing it with captions like, "Stay calm, stay factual, stay unstoppable." For young women watching, especially Black women in law, it felt personal. The composure she held wasn't just performance, it was inheritance. It was every time someone told them to tone it down, turned into power instead of apology. News outlets published think pieces overnight. The Atlantic called it the moment truth went viral. The Washington Post wrote, "Crockett didn't just win the exchange, she restored faith in discourse itself." The public devoured it. Hashtags turned into headlines. Headlines turned into rallying cries. It wasn't just entertainment, it was emotional justice. Clips of Patel's frozen face became reaction GIFs, uploaded, remixed, looped endlessly. But even amid the humor, something deeper stirred. People recognized themselves in her restraint, in her refusal to perform outrage, in her belief that truth could still win without screaming. For a culture drowning in noise, her composure felt revolutionary. In barbershops, classrooms, and kitchens, people replayed the clip not for drama, but for hope. The narrator framed it best. For once, arrogance met its match, and truth didn't just survive, It went viral. And still, the shockwaves kept spreading. Fact-checkers pored over Patel's record, uncovering contradictions he'd hoped were buried. New hearings were called. Journalists followed the trail of omissions exposed in that single question. What began as a moment of silence turned into an investigation, then into a movement. One late night, Crockett's own team sat in a dim office, screens glowing with mentions and messages from across the country. One aide whispered, "We knew it would hit, but not like this." Crockett said nothing, only watched the numbers climb. Her expression wasn't triumphant, it was resolute. She understood that virality fades, but the truth it reveals doesn't. The narrator lowers the tone, letting the air thicken with reflection. Every great reckoning starts small, a word, a pause, a look that refuses to yield. What began as a question had become a mirror, forcing a nation to see what it had tolerated for too long. But the real story wasn't the takedown, it was the reckoning it unleashed. Yet, even in victory, the real meaning of that moment went deeper. When the noise faded and the headlines began to blur, what remained was the image of a woman sitting still in a storm that wanted her to flinch. In the quiet days after the hearing, a journalist asked Representative Jasmine Crockett what she thought the moment meant. She paused, then said simply, "When power lies, it hopes will lower our eyes. I won't." The line spread almost as quickly as the clip that birthed it. It was more than defiance, it was declaration. For millions who had watched her silence cut through the fog of performance, those words crystallized something they'd felt but hadn't yet named. Courage isn't loud, it's consistent. The narrator's voice returned, softer now, reverent but steady. This was never about one exchange in one hearing room. It was about the slow corrosion of truth, the way impunity hides behind microphones, the way arrogance wears civility as a mask. What she did wasn't theatrical, it was necessary. Crockett's calm had become a kind of sermon, wordless but unyielding. She reminded the country that democracy doesn't collapse in chaos, it erodes in silence. Every time someone lets dishonesty pass unchecked, every time truth is treated like an inconvenience, the foundation weakens. And that's why her voice mattered, not for its volume, but for its refusal to look away. Clips of her reflection aired on late-night shows and morning programs alike. "When power lies," anchors would quote, "it hopes will lower our eyes." The phrase landed differently each time, sometimes as defiance, sometimes as prayer. It became a digital mantra for teachers, lawyers, students, organizers. It wasn't about partisanship anymore. It was about principle. The narrator continued, weaving her legacy into something larger. This wasn't politics, this was principle. A woman refused to play by the rules of performance, and in doing so, rewrote them. She turned silence into statement, restraint into resistance. And through her, the audience, the millions watching from homes, buses, classrooms, saw a reflection of their own quiet endurance. For every viewer who'd ever been dismissed, underestimated, or told to be more polite, that moment became proof that composure can be its own revolution. Crockett's control was not softness, it was strength disciplined by purpose. She didn't fight noise with more noise, she dismantled it with clarity. Footage of her final look across the table still circulated weeks later. Commentators called it the stare that restored accountability. Artists painted it, poets quoted it, professors used it in lectures on rhetoric and courage. But to her, it was never performance. It was a promise, to hold the line no matter how loud the room becomes. The camera's lens, the narrator said, can't capture conviction, but you could feel it in the silence that followed her words. She had drawn a boundary, not just for Patel, but for everyone watching. Every era needs its line in the sand, and that day she drew it. And if that truth moved you, your part in this story begins now.
If you felt that silence, if you recognized that courage, don't let it fade. That moment in the hearing wasn't just a confrontation between two people. It was a mirror held up to all of us. For a few seconds, the world saw what happens when composure meets deception, when principle refuses to bow. And that clarity doesn't belong to one person. It belongs to everyone who refuses to settle for less than truth. Patel couldn't answer. He stumbled, deflected, and faltered. But maybe now we can answer in our own way, by standing louder for the truth, by refusing to let arrogance dominate our conversations, our communities, our culture. This isn't a call to watch quietly. It's a call to act. Share what you've seen. Talk about what it means. Let the ripple of accountability travel far beyond the walls of that chamber. When you like, when you share, when you subscribe, you're not just clicking a button. You're joining a movement that says courage doesn't have to scream, but it will always be heard. A movement that refuses to let manipulation go unchecked, that demands integrity, transparency, and respect. Every replay, every mention, every conversation builds the kind of momentum that silence alone can never create. Because truth doesn't whisper, it roars. And every time you share it, you turn up the volume. Every voice counts, every action matters, and every one of us has the power to make sure that when the next moment of accountability arrives, we're ready to stand with it, not behind it. The line has been drawn. The silence has spoken. Now it's your turn to carry the sound forward.